Good afternoon, everyone who's joining us on the East Coast of the U.S., and good morning to those of you who are in other U.S. time zones. We're delighted that so many of you are joining us for this webinar being sponsored by MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. You can see the title there, Are States Recognizing and Responding to the Needs of Their Dual Language Learner Children? I'm Margie McHugh. I'm the Director of MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get going, let me just go through a few housekeeping details. You can see there the link or the web address for slides and audio from today's webinar. You'll be able to find them there on our website. If you have any problems accessing the webinar, please use the phone number you see on the screen, 266-1921, or email us at events@migrationpolicy.org. That email account is being monitored for the entire time that the webinar is going on. So we have a number of people who, from our communications team, that are able to help you with any issues you might be having. Please, throughout the webinar, use the Q&A chat function on the right of the screen. It's very helpful to us to get your questions beforehand so that we can figure out how to weave them into the conversation. Of course, we're happy to take them at the end also, but it just is nice to receive them in advance so that we can sort of queue them up for the different speakers. You can also send your questions to the same events@migrationpolicy.org email address, or you can tweet them to the handle that you see there on the screen. So as you may already know from having seen the webinar invitation, Maki Park, who's policy analyst and program coordinator with our center, is both the lead author of the documents that we're releasing today and also a lead speaker for today's webinar. She is our key policy analyst working on early childhood issues and on our various programs in that area. Julie Sugarman will also be speaking. She's a policy analyst with us as well. She's got a very deep background in dual language education programs and then also in language learning issues more generally, both for DLLs and for students in elementary and secondary education. And based on some, both the work that she's done in assisting with conceptualizing the fact sheets and other work that she's done on quality rating systems in the early childhood space, we're really looking forward to having her input, pulling out some of the important policies that you'll see in the fact sheets. And then we're just delighted that Professor Marlene Zepeda from California State University, I should say Professor Emerita, Marlene Zepeda is joining us. Most of you, I'm sure, will recognize her name. She's been a lead thinker and actor on issues related to the education of dual language learners for many, many years, and we're delighted that she'll be able to give some remarks and feedback after we roll out a little bit for you some of the key elements of the documents. So what we're speaking about today is, first of all, a national demographic and policy profile of dual language learners, as well as a series of fact sheets for the top 30 states with the most dual language learners. The fact they're both, in a sense, data sheets as well as policy sheets. So they're an interesting combination, we think, of information that we've heard from stakeholders in many areas of our work, that this combination of information would be extremely interesting and helpful to them. So first of all, what the fact sheet series does is give an updated analysis of the key characteristics of dual language learner children and their parents. And of course, there's always a lot of interest in that because the numbers are changing from time to time. There are a lot of key socio-demographic characteristics that are of interest both to policymakers and community stakeholders. So of course, we wanted to deliver that through these products. But in addition, we've had a lot of feedback from our various state partners, immigrant and refugee policy organizations in different states that are working on these issues, for example, as well as early childhood programs and advocates, that making more visible some of the key state policies that would support DLLs across the different programs in the ECEC space was something that we got a lot of feedback would be helpful to folks who are trying to understand how their states are doing, understand what other options might be out there for their states to adopt, and the like. And so, so you'll see that here that also for that reason we thought that the series would be able to both inform and prompt conversations about the strength of DLL policies in particular states, and then also give a bit of a roadmap to stakeholders both inside and outside of government in terms of what sort of supportive policies they might want to consider. So now to give us a bit of a tour of the fact sheets and begin to just tell you more about what is there in them, let me turn it over to Maki Park, who, as I said earlier, is really the lead both with developing this fact sheet series and really the caretaker and the strategist around so much of our work in the early childhood space. Maki, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Margie. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to be sharing this new resource and data with you and hope that it's going to be a useful and practical tool for many of you. So as Margie was saying, I'm planning on providing an overview of the fact sheets to walk through some of the data findings at the national level, and also to talk about the information that you'll encounter in each of the state fact sheets, why these data and information are significant, and how we chose the policy areas that we highlight in these documents. Once I've had a chance to go through this overview, my colleague Julie will be talking more in depth about the system-level policies that we go over in the fact sheets to give more information and perspective on how these policies really impact dual language learners in classrooms and early childhood systems. And then finally, Marlene will be discussing with us in more detail some of the practical considerations that should be taken into account when thinking about how to really improve quality of instruction for young DLLs and what that can look like. And she'll also speak to us about some of the ongoing initiatives in California to address DLL needs, where she's been a leader in this field. But before I launch into an overview and walk through the fact sheets, I did first want to address the issue of who a dual language learner is and how we define this population in these fact sheets. So as many of you likely know, a recent policy statement put out by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education defines DLLs as children who have a home language other than English and are learning 2 or more languages at the same time, or learning a second language while continuing to develop their first language. Of course, in early childhood, all children, whether DLLs or not, are emergent English language learners. As a result, we can't really label, for example, a 1-year-old based on their own language ability. So instead, we define these young children by their language environment, by defining DLLs as those who have at least one parent who speaks a language other than English in the home. This means that these young children are exposed to 2 languages as they develop and enter the K-12 school system and have the potential to develop as bilingual or multilingual individuals. I say this because it's important to note that we're not equating DLL status with being limited English proficient, and I want to clarify that this population represents a very wide spectrum of abilities, both in their home languages as well as in English language. I also did want to clarify that having a home language other than English is not itself a risk factor. On the contrary, extensive research now indicates the many benefits of bilingualism, and we see the home language skills that young children bring into their classrooms as an incredibly important asset. However, we do also see that this population demonstrates several risk factors, including significantly higher levels of poverty than their peers, that we do want to call policy attention to. So with that said, I'm going to move into giving an overview of the national sociodemographic data on young DLLs ages 0 through 8. First, looking at numbers and growth for this population, DLLs now make up 32%, or almost a third of the nation's young child population. And in 24 states, as well as in the District of Columbia, they make up over 20% of young children. So this is a substantial group across the country that's large and growing. Overall, the population of DLLs has grown by 24% since the year 2000. Nationally, over half, or 58% of DLLs live in low-income families, compared with 43% of their peers. And 26% of parents of DLLs have less than a high school education, compared with only 6% of their non-DLL peers. And these are both important risk factors in terms of thinking about future outcomes for these young children. And yet, DLLs are also less likely to be enrolled in pre-K programs in spite of the importance of high-quality early learning opportunities to contribute to kindergarten readiness and reduce potential achievement gaps. Only 42% of DLLs ages 3 and 4 are enrolled in pre-K programs, compared with 48% of non-DLLs. And you can see these rates of enrollment for your own states in the fact sheets, but this discrepancy in enrollment is evident across the board. And then finally, looking at diversity within the DLL population, in terms of race and ethnicity, 62% of DLLs are Hispanic, 16% are white, 15% Asian, 6% Black, and 1% American Indian. The top home languages spoken by parents of DLLs are Spanish, Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and Arabic. Again, at the state level, you'll see all of this data laid out, and especially in terms of languages spoken, you will see much greater diversity at the local level. And this, of course, has implications in terms of early childhood system capacity to respond to linguistic diversity, with speakers of lower incidence languages being much less likely to have translation or interpretation services available to them, or to have staff that reflect their language or culture in the classroom. The fact sheets also include information for each state about English learner achievement in 4th grade NAEP scores, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress. These data are meant to indicate cross-state performance of English learner students compared to their peers and demonstrate the potential achievement gap that can open up for DLLs as they move through their academic careers in the absence of supportive policies. And this is important since children are expected to have foundational reading and math skills by the time they reach 3rd grade. And academic success beyond this point is very dependent on the skills developed before this period, which again points to the critical importance of the early years. Nationwide, you can see in this slide that English learners have substantially lower scores in both reading and math compared to their peers, demonstrating the importance of early childhood interventions that can reduce these disparities early on. Of course, however, these assessments are English language only assessments, which also means that the full breadth of English learners' abilities are not fully reflected. But taken together, this socio-demographic snapshot of DLLs and a look at their enrollment rates and later academic outcomes shows the need for programs and policies that support DLLs in their development and recognize and foster their home language skills. I'm going to transition now into giving a quick walkthrough of what you'll be able to find in each of the state fact sheets in terms of state-level policies that have the potential to affect DLL outcomes in early learning. This, of course, is not a comprehensive list of all policies that are relevant to DLLs, but rather a high-level view of some of the systemic issues that impact all states, regardless of where they are in their early childhood system development. Because there is so much variability between states and even among districts, we only provide top-line information in these fact sheets, but my colleagues will be talking in greater detail about the on-the-ground implications of some of these issues in a moment. We gathered the information for this policy section of the fact sheets primarily through surveys we conducted of state agencies, so these responses are for the most part self-reported. And with that, the first policy area that you'll see highlighted in the fact sheets are policies that affect the whole ECEC system. And Julie will be talking about these shortly, so I'll just list them here. The first is bilingual education policies, or whether states promote or restrict bilingual education opportunities. The second is quality rating and improvement systems, and whether these are specifically addressing DLLs and their standards. And the third is kindergarten entry or readiness assessments, and whether or not states are providing guidance specifically on how to administer these so that they are relevant and valid for DLLs. Next, we look at the Child Care and Development Fund. This is a federal program that provides support for states to offer child care subsidies to low-income families. As they make these subsidies available to families, states can use a number of strategies to make them more accessible to immigrant and LEP families. For example, by providing materials or translating their website into non-English languages and conducting community outreach to make sure that families are aware of these resources. States can also provide support for child care providers who are immigrant or LEP through these funds, for example, by offering training and technical assistance in other languages, as well as translating their own documents such as health and safety requirements or permitting and contract materials in other languages. So you'll see in the state fact sheets whether or not your states are using some of these strategies to try and promote equitable access to these resources and improve the quality of care that DLL families are receiving. We also take a look at home visiting programs. The Federal Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, or MICV, is now funding all 50 states. And this program offers assistance to low-income families with young children through regular home visits and access to health, social service, and child development support free of charge. The home visiting model can be particularly effective for immigrant and limited English proficient parents of young children who may be living in more isolated circumstances and have difficulty accessing other social services. Low-threshold programs like this one that physically meet families where they are can serve as an important on-ramp for other services that can benefit these families and their young children. As a starting point, collecting data at the state level on race and ethnicity, home language, and limited English proficiency status is important to enable states to understand which populations they're reaching and potentially promote more equitable access. However, LEP status and race and ethnicity are not currently part of the equation in terms of targeting these services in most states. Finally, we draw from the National Institute for Early Education Research's State of Preschool Yearbook Survey on DLL policies to show how states are accounting for DLL needs as they build and expand their state pre-K programs, which are now available in 43 states and the District of Columbia. Tracking enrollment of DLLs is, of course, an important starting point to gather the data needed to make this population visible in program and policy improvement. Using home language as eligibility criteria can also promote access for this population, especially as they do stand to benefit disproportionately from high-quality early learning services. Making sure that DLLs are assessed in their home language is also crucial to getting a full and accurate picture of their development, and requiring teachers to have qualifications relevant to teaching DLLs can contribute significantly to instructional quality. These are just some of the policies that states can enact to better serve a diverse young child population as they build and expand their state pre-K programs. But the majority of states have not yet put these into place, as you can see in both the national and state fact sheets. I want to mention before turning this over to Julie that the national fact sheet also offers a look at some particularly promising initiatives that states are taking on, both within these policy areas as well as beyond these particular opportunities, in an effort to improve services for DLLs overall. We're hoping that by spotlighting some of these ongoing strategies, that this will make them more visible for those who are looking for innovative ways to improve system responsiveness in their states and communities. And that's it for me. So back over to you, Margie.
Great, thanks, Maki. So as Maki laid out, there are quite a few important programs in the ECEC space at the state level. We tried, based on a lot of the feedback that we received from some of the key partners that we have that we're working with at the state and local level as they try and enter into this field and think about what are the key policies that they should be considering or hoping that their states will consider in order to improve access and equity for dual language learners. Obviously, there are a lot of programs there, but as Maki was saying when she referred to the system-wide policies, in addition to those program silos, there are some higher-level system policies that we know a lot of folks want to focus on because it's a great way of educating a large number of stakeholders in their state governments or in the early childhood field about the needs of dual language learners and children from immigrant and refugee families more broadly. So that's what Julie Sugarman from our team is about to focus on now. As I said earlier, she's got a lot of great background in language learning more generally and increasingly in the space in the transition from early childhood up into K-3 programs. So Julie, over to you.
Great, thanks Margie. I'm really delighted to be here with you all today. And before I speak about the specifics the system-level policies, I just wanted to take a moment to look at the purpose of these policies. So as many of you know, the achievement of traditionally underserved groups is a major concern throughout the country. So many states are focused on ensuring equitable access to high-quality education and care with the hope of reducing those systemic achievement gaps. And second, policymakers have increasingly recognized the connection between high-quality ECEC and student success in the K-12 system. So states have been working to improve the alignment between the two systems in policy initiatives such as curriculum development, teacher training, and assessment. Some states also use educational policy to promote particular approaches that they believe will be effective for meeting students' needs. While some states leave most of the detailed decision-making up to local educators, others might create policies around issues like home language development or providing early and targeted interventions to students who show signs of struggling. And finally, states also create policies for the purpose of holding publicly funded institutions accountable for helping students meet educational expectations. So the first set of policies we'll look at is whether states mandate or forbid the use of bilingual education. This is one of the most important state policies with regard to the education of DLLs, since we know that supporting native language development in the early years has a host of benefits in terms of linguistic, academic, and socio-emotional development of language minority students. The 9 states colored teal on this map require schools to offer some type of bilingual education program in cases where a school has a sufficient number of speakers of a single non-English language to make bilingual education feasible. Most of these states just address K-12 education, but 2, Illinois and Texas, extend the mandate to include state-funded pre-K as well. With California having recently passed a ballot initiative that overturned its previous bilingual ban, we now just have 3 states that have laws restricting the use of bilingual education in the K-12 system. Those states, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Tennessee, are colored orange on the map. And although it's important to note that Massachusetts continued to have bilingual programs through a parental waiver provision, and policymakers there are considering reversing the law. Additionally, South Carolina requires that state pre-K classes be conducted only in English. All of the other states that are neither teal nor orange allow schools and districts to decide whether to offer bilingual education or not. The second set of policies I want to talk about are quality rating and improvement systems, or QRIs. And as Maki said, these policies are addressed in the fact sheet. But for those of you who'd like more detailed information, I want to point to a paper that you see the cover of here that Maki and I wrote that was just released last month, entitled Quality for Whom? Supporting Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Children and Workers in Early Childhood Quality Rating and Improvement Systems. And you can access this paper from the Migration Policy website. I'm mostly going to talk about the rating piece of QRIS. But the paper goes into considerable detail about the policies that surround QRIS development and implementation more broadly. Since states began to implement QRIS in the mid-1990s, they have emerged as a sort of organizing framework for a state's vision of quality ECEC. One way they improve alignment across systems is that they lay out a path for programs to go from minimal health and safety standards of licensing to the rigorous standards of accreditation. Another way that QRIS serve as an organizing framework is to articulate a common definition of program quality across settings, including Head Start, family and center-based child care, summer programs, after-school care, and so on. The overall intention of QRIS is to improve quality of ECEC through program support and to provide information to consumers so that the competitive market of early childhood programs can reward higher quality programs. All QRIS have 5 common elements. First are program standards. These are specific and measurable indicators of quality in a wide variety of areas. Some standards are organized as a point system, so that as a practitioner accumulates points for each high-quality practice she demonstrates, she'll be able to move towards a higher level of implementation. Others are organized around levels so that practitioners have to show that they meet all of the indicators at a level and then are given a designation such as 1 star, 2 stars, etc. Second, states and their partners offer training and technical assistance on practices that demonstrate alignment with quality standards. Third, all states that have QRIS offer some kind of support and incentives to do what it takes to attain higher ratings, with some providing higher subsidy rates for programs that meet the higher standards. Fourth, as a rating system, a large part of QRIS is quality assurance and monitoring through assessment of participating providers. And finally, QRIS provides consumer education by setting up a website where parents can investigate the ratings of programs in their community. As we were doing the research for this paper, we looked at a number of state program standards to see what kind of indicators could be developed that, or have been developed, that support the education and care of DLLs. So now I just want to give you a few examples of the types of quality practices that states can encourage through their inclusion as rating indicators. The first one is from Colorado, and it's that the program provides documentation or written policy of the use of interpreters or other resources for help with languages of enrolled families. And this was one of the most common ones we saw in the states that we examined. A lot of states include a quality indicator around the use of translators or being able to communicate with families in a language they understand. The second one is from Massachusetts. Materials reflect the language and culture of the children in the classroom, their communities, and represent the diversity of society. Some that we looked at talk very specifically about how many materials and what kinds of materials, but I think, you know, this is generally left up to programs to decide how to demonstrate that they align with this standard. The third one is from New Mexico. There is evidence in lesson plans and center logs that center staff encourage family members to share cultural heritage and practices, stories, activities, and language in the daily classroom activities. So that gets at actual parent involvement in the classroom and sharing that, those cultural resources. And finally, from New York, program staff is trained to address the needs of children whose home language is not English. And New York actually has a database where they can show evidence that at least 60% of teaching staff in the program that's being evaluated have attended the relevant training within the previous 15 months. So the third policy area I want to discuss is assessment, and I want to start with kindergarten entry or readiness assessments. These are assessments given to students just as they start kindergarten, and they are meant to evaluate a child's development in general learning, including things like vocabulary and cognitive skills, as well as things like socio-emotional and motor skills. The purpose of these assessments is to identify gaps in ECEC curriculum and instruction so that programs can do a better job helping students develop the skills that will help them succeed in kindergarten. Results are also used to help educators design their K-3 curriculum by pointing out what skills most students already have and which need to be developed. And then third, they identify supports that individual students need. There are a number of policies that states can put into place to ensure that the use of kindergarten readiness assessments are valid and reliable for DLLs. First, some states have policies requiring native language accommodations, including the use of translated assessments or interpreters. Conducting the assessment in a language the child understands is really important because these assessments are not meant to evaluate how well students speak English, but rather to what degree they have developed foundational skills. If students can't understand the questions or provide answers in English, that doesn't mean that they don't understand the relevant concepts, such as counting from 1 to 10 or how to listen and follow directions. States can also develop policies to ensure the meaningful interpretation and use of DLL scores. For example, these assessments are usually written based on what we know about the developmental trajectories of monolingual children. So test users need to understand to what extent the results obtained from bilingual children might differ. They also need to understand the difference between a DLL child who scores a 0 on English vocabulary because he hasn't learned English yet, and a student who scores a 0 because she potentially has a learning disability. The other assessment system that is relevant to DLL policy is the language proficiency assessment. Students entering kindergarten who are identified as potentially English learners based on the languages spoken at home must be given an English proficiency assessment within 30 days of enrollment. These assessments are aligned to the English Learner Assessment System used throughout the K-12 system. All but 6 states have joined one of the 2 assessment consortia, WIDA and ELPA 21, so policies around assessment in those states are generally aligned with the recommendations from the consortia. And the last thing that I want to mention is a potential policy shift due to the federal Every Student Succeeds Act. In some states, it used to be that the procedures for identifying who is an English learner would vary from district to district, meaning that a student might be an English learner if he or she ended up in one district but not in another. As part of ESSA, states must develop consistent procedures for identification of English learners that are the same across districts. For the most part, this formal process takes place once a student enters kindergarten, but given the increased emphasis on ECEC to K-12 alignment and on the measurement of opportunity and achievement gaps, it remains to be seen if the new standardization of EL entry and exit criteria will have implications for pre-K EL identification. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Margie.
Great, thanks, Julie. Let me just say before I introduce Marlene that if please remember to submit your questions now using the that box at the right of your screen. You can just put them there through the chat function with us, or please send them to events@migrationpolicy.org. After Professor Zepeda's presentation, we'll be turning to your questions, so it would be helpful to have more of them in advance. So now it's both an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Marlene Zepeda. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with her work. She has a tremendous record of scholarship in the area of dual language learner children's needs and effective practices for working with them. She has an extraordinary CV, so I'll just pull out that most recently she was a member of she was involved with the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's report related to the educational success of children and youth who are learning English, and she's been deeply involved. One of the things that reasons we're so delighted to have her is that she's not just an expert in policy and practice. She is actively trying to help the California system build itself out to respond to these issues. So she's got a lot of insight and experience from having worked on many of the major initiatives that are underway in California to try and improve the system's responsiveness to the needs of dual language learners. And so she's going to give us a bit of a tour of those different issues and some insights related to that system building work as part of her reaction to what we're presenting here in terms of the key policies that we know a lot of states have their eye on. So Marlene, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Margie. I'm delighted to be here with everyone, either in the morning or the afternoon, depending upon what time zone you're in. And what I'd like to do is to accomplish 3 things with my allotted time. I have my timer on, so I stay within my time frame. And the first thing is to provide some comments regarding how our perspective is shifting with regards to DLLs, and sometimes they're called English language learners. So sometimes you'll see in my PowerPoint those 2 terms interchangeably. I won't go into the definitional differences at this point. I want to quickly give an overview of some of the policy guidance that the state of California has developed over the course of the last decade. And I also want to mention towards the end some of the really exciting changes that are going on here in the state of California, which I think has really important implications for the education of children whose home language is not English. So let's start with the demographics of the state of California. California, these numbers are from the fact sheets that was produced by the Migration Policy Institute. Here in California, we, in the K-12 system, we educate 23% of the nation's English language learners reside in the state of California. So it has been a real imperative for the state to really start to look at them. And one of the issues that we finally have gotten a handle on is the number of children in the 0 to 5 population, because often they are not in state systems, and it was very hard for us to get a sense of the numbers. And our statewide First 5 Commission more recently reported that 60% or close to 60% of our young dual language learners in the state of California are dual language learners. And you can see that the majority speak Spanish, but we have over 100 languages here in the state. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time on these issues that are pointed out here, because I think that we are coming to a different mindset with regard to children whose home language is not English. First of all, there's a growing recognition of the educational needs of these children. Even though we have a demographic imperative, we also know that they have unique learning needs. And one of the very, very important issues, I think, that is going on in our discussion nationally is a movement away from a deficit model to a strength-based model, where we recognize the assets and the potential of these children. And that is a different way of thinking that we have been proposing for a long time, but often is not reflected in the way that policy is rolled out. Thirdly, I think, and this is something that I've been grappling with since graduate school, and that is an appreciation of both what is universal for child growth and development versus what is culturally and linguistically specific for child growth and development, something that anthropologists have recognized for a long time. But we need to understand those two different trajectories and how they interact with each other. And then finally, the National Academy of Sciences report entitled Promoting the Educational Success of Children and Youth Learning English is very clear from the research consensus study that the use of the home language supports the acquisition of English. And that is really important as we move forward in our policy discussion. So here in California, what you're seeing here is this is our system that actually I've been involved with for a while. And at the center of that system is the Learning and Development Foundations. And those are often called early learning standards in other states. And what emanates from the Learning and Development Foundations are a set of other kinds of policy guidance documents, including curriculum frameworks, an assessment measure, teacher competencies, and guidelines. And I'm going to talk about each one of these very quickly. Okay, so in this first set of documents that you see on the slide, the Preschool Learning Foundations and the accompanying curriculum frameworks, the foundations were published in 2008. And it was the first time that a set of early learning standards were developed for English language development for preschool children. It was the first attempt to do that in our nation's history. And so it was really groundbreaking at the time. And many of us think it needs to be updated given all the newer research, but at the time it was very groundbreaking. And there's an accompanying document called the Preschool Curriculum Framework that specifically talks about teaching strategies for children whose home language is not English. And all of these materials that you're going to see in the next set of slides are available on the web as PDF downloadable files for those of you who might be interested. The next resource is an assessment resource, and that is our Desired Results Developmental Profile. Now, this is a formative assessment of child development that is required in state preschool programs, and many Head Start programs use it. Within the DRDP, as we call it, the preschool portion of it actually has 4 items that try to measure that measure how well children are acquiring English. And what's really important about this particular measure is that the teachers who are observing the children and collecting the information can accept the child's response in their home language, or if they do not know the child's home language, they can get someone to help them. They can even ask parents about it. So it's not this kind of formal assessment where the child is sitting down and you're giving them some blocks to identify colors, numbers, shapes, things of that sort. It's primarily an observational tool. And the state of California has been using this, and I believe it's been used in other states as well. We also have a set of professional educator competencies that consist of 12 areas. It's a really thick document. But within those teacher competencies are 2 specific areas focused on children whose home language is not English and focus on culture, diversity, and equity. Again, that is available for download. More recently, we've developed the state of California developed revised their preschool guidelines in 2015, and that's also out. And what's really important here, I think, that has shifted in my experience within the state is that there is a dedicated chapter on dual language learners, and within the document itself, information about DLL children is integrated throughout. And that is actually based, a lot of that information in the preschool guidelines is based on this next publication that you see in front of you, which is a set of research papers that was developed by the state, and that actually informs the preschool guidelines. And this is when the state of California gathered a number of experts from across the nation, brought them together to discuss the topics and to develop specific research-based information about dual language learning, ranging from the neuroscience down to early intervention and assessment. And all of these papers, again, are available on the web. And then the final resource that I want to talk about really is the original policy guidance that was developed by the State Department of Education, entitled the Preschool English Learner Resource Guide. And that, the second edition came out in, I believe, 2008. I'll have to check on that. Yeah, 2009, I'm sorry, the second edition came out in 2009. And there is this is translated into Spanish. This is also available for download. And this is more of a general overview of dual language learners, and it also includes some teaching practice guidelines inside of it as well. And there is a very nice companion DVD that accompanies it, and it's also available in Spanish, where it talks about the stages of second language acquisition that we often talk about in the field. Okay. Now, let's move on to some of the policy issues that are going on here in the state of California, and I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm trying to rush. One of the things that is going on actually nationally, but it originated here in the state of California, is the Seal of Biliteracy. Now, the Seal of Biliteracy is an award given by a school, a district, or a state in recognition of students who have studied and attained proficiency in 2 or more languages by high school graduation. So it's reading, writing, and speaking. And the Seal of Biliteracy became effective in California in 2012 under AB 815, sponsored by Julia Brownlee, who is now in the House of Representatives. And over the course of this time frame until present day, we've had over 43,000 students receive the Seal of Biliteracy. Currently, 29 states and the District of Columbia have the Seal of Biliteracy. They've passed legislation to have the Seal of Biliteracy offered in their states. The latest one is Missouri, and that's not shown on the map because that just is breaking news. So, Julia Brownlee, who is in the House of Representatives, is sponsoring a bill to initiate a federal seal of biliteracy for the nation. So we'll see how that works out. Two other big developments here in the state of California have to do with our last election, where the state passed Proposition 58, entitled the EDGE Initiative. It is called the Education for Global Economy Initiative, so that's why we call it the EDGE. What's really noteworthy about this particular proposition is that it passed with 72.5% of California voters voting for it in the affirmative. And this initiative is important because it basically rescinds aspects of our English-only law known as Proposition 227 that constrain parents from choosing bilingual education and dual immersion educational programs for their children. So Proposition 58 is now is now part of the law, and so parents now have the option of choosing bilingual education. The proposition, it should be noted, emphasizes English proficiency. So we're not saying that children should not be proficient in English, but it emphasizes it while at the same time they're learning another language. In conjunction with Proposition 58, or around the same time, our State Board of Education has just adopted an EL roadmap. And this roadmap is pre-K-12. And it provides a vision and set of principles that underscores English language proficiency, grade level standards, while developing multiple languages. And I want to quote Dr. Lori Olson's remarks to the State Board of Education. You can find this on YouTube. It was very emotional because not having your language or not being able to speak your language is very emotional for many people who are exposed to 2 or more languages. So what Lori said was that the roadmap is not just about ending an era. It's also about breaking new ground and setting us on a road towards asset-based schooling that embraces the language and cultures of our students, and towards providing solidly research-based, coherent, and comprehensive programs for the 1.3 million English language learners in our schools. And in doing so, the California Roadmap offers a vision, a beacon, an example to the rest of the nation about what it means to honor equity, ensure meaningful access, embrace our wonderfully diverse population. And finally, I want to end with some forthcoming activities and events that are going on here in California. And the first one is an advocacy framework for young dual language learners, which I am working on and will be released sometime in mid-November. And this is basically a policy document that calls for coordinated action to integrate pre-K with the K through 3 system. And it will be focusing on workforce development, curriculum and instruction. It will be focusing on assessment and on systems alignment. So that's forthcoming. Oh, my timer just went off. And here in California, our California First 5 Commission has invested quite a bit of money in identifying effective strategies that support dual language learners, and that is forthcoming. They will be conducting pilot studies up and down the state to identify and describe effective teaching strategies for young dual language learners. And then finally, the State Department of Education will be releasing a revised set of infant-toddler program guidelines, and there's a dedicated chapter on infants and toddlers, because I know a lot of the work is focused on 3- and 4-year-olds, and this is 0 to 3. And there's going to be references to working with infants and toddlers whose home language is not English throughout that document. So those, very quickly, are a lot of, I took you down memory lane in terms of all of the things that we have been doing here in the state of California, and we look forward to continuing this work because we know that it's the right thing to do for children. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marlene. That was terrific. For all of you who have been writing in asking if the presentation slides will be available, yes, they will be up on our website shortly after after we end. And then I would just suggest to folks, there we go, if you could keep writing in your questions or emailing them, and then we have got a lot of questions, so thanks everyone for being so active with sending questions in, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible over the next 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will, if there are any we don't get to, we'll just be sure to answer them. Answer them individually online afterwards. So I wanted to, Maki, start with a question that had to do with the analysis, and it just was asking if we could talk a little bit more about how NPI estimated the number of DLLs enrolled in pre-K, since, as we noted, under half of states have policies to collect that information. How is it that we were able to get it? Maki? I don't know if you're,
great.
There you go.
I just had to unmute myself there. Yes, it's a great question, and so the pre-K data that I was referring to that was collected from the NIER yearbook refers only to state pre-K programs, whereas the pre-K data that we cite in the fact sheet in terms of the socio-demographic analysis refers to any type of pre-K, which, as you know, pre-K is pretty loosely defined in terms of what formally constitutes childcare versus preschool. But this information was taken from the U.S. Census American Community Surveys. For 3- and 4-year-olds, families can report whether or not their children are enrolled in pre-K. So again, this isn't specific to state pre-K, but whether or not their kids are enrolled in something that they would consider pre-K. So it is a broader frame. And it is, in fact, the only way to gather this data that we're aware of at the moment, since most states are not collecting this data at a state level, unfortunately. Thanks for the question.
Great. And then Julie, there's we have more than one question that that has to do with the question of language skills, I guess I would say, of program staff. So just broadly speaking, obviously there are some issues where early learning or kindergarten teachers are trying to conduct observational assessments of children who speak a home language that the teacher doesn't speak, and where interpreters aren't available. And so, you know, there are just 2 or 3 questions in this cluster about what do you do when you simply don't have the language skills. Are there resources, or, you know, how are systems addressing this?
Yeah, this is a really huge issue, especially as we have so many programs that have students with a number of different languages. So there are a few specific protocols in early childhood that look at dual language learners, but they're more like observation protocols. I know another question was looking at, you know, sort of the observation of a whole classroom. I would point out the CASEBA, the Classroom Assessment of Supports for Emergent Bilingual Acquisition, and the Early Language and Literacy Classroom Observation Addendum for Dual Language Learners. There's been quite a lot of work done on what does it look like in a dual language classroom to be teaching, you know, students who don't speak the same language, and so those tools do address those issues. But in terms of assessing individual students, it really is important for communicating with the students and communicating with the parents to try to identify some way of having translation for these assessments, either using a language line or using volunteers from the community. It's definitely a pressing problem that you know, schools are just sort of going ahead and counting on the kids to be able to answer these questions. I mean, as I said, you also can do the test in English and then sort of consider the score in context. you know, any test of a young child should never be used for high-stakes purposes, and one individual score should never be thought of as the be-all, end-all of what any child can do, and even not young children. The same is true of older children. But it can start to give you an indication if a student has been in an English medium pre-K for 2 years and yet can't answer basic questions in English, there might be something going on there. So that would be just a way to use the English version that you do have in order to start getting some information about any particular child. This might not be the best moment, but I'm thinking, Maki, maybe you could say a word or two about the Super Diversity project that we've got underway, which is trying to kind of figure out, in a sense, you know, what are programs across the country doing as they obviously don't have the language bridges, I guess I would say, or the teacher skills in order to be able to be effective with working with super diverse populations?
Right. I was going to say, I guess a more pessimistic response to that question would be to say that really most states don't translate their assessments at all, and certainly not beyond Spanish or potentially Chinese. And assessment in particular is tricky, but research is very thin on how to support, you know, given the importance of home language that the research shows, how to support speakers of lower incidence minority languages, as I was saying. And we do have a forthcoming report that's going to just showcase the incredible amount of diversity within the DLL population in terms of languages spoken, as well as some other indicators across the U.S., and pointing to the need for additional research. And also trying to do some initial field building to show what kinds of promising practices may be out there for teachers who are really working in classrooms where multiple languages are spoken and potentially no staff on hand who speak the home languages of all the that all the young children represent. So please stay tuned, and we're looking forward to getting that report out as well.
Excellent. And so then, Marlene and Julie, I'll just give you 2 questions and answer whichever one or both if you feel passionate about both of them. So the first question is, are there classroom observation items aligned with the QRIS standards that can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of the dual language program? So just a question about alignment there, classroom observation with QRIS. And then also, has any of the research addressed DLL's access to supportive services once they're enrolled in schools? For example, IEPs, and the questioner notes that obtaining access to IEPs in a minor's native language has been challenging in North and South Carolina, for example. And so do you have any advice related to that? So Marlene, do you want to go first?
Yeah, let me go first with the QRIS. Julie mentioned a couple of assessments that try to look at DLL issues within QRIS, the CACEBA and the ELCO DLL. We're still working on that issue. That is a big hole in terms of, or need that we have. We know that DLL pedagogy is different, needs to be somewhat different than it is for all children. And so those particular accommodations, like using props and more visual cues, previewing the vocabulary, et cetera, are not often within these kinds of standard measures. And so we're working on that. We're very aware of the need for that within our QRIS system here in California. We're trying to find some indicators beyond, if you look at the QRIS report from the Migration Policy Council, we need to kind of look under the hood beyond the general issue of how many materials you have in the classroom that are culturally specific or language specific. We need to look more closely, I believe, at the teaching and learning interactions between the adults and the children. And I just want to say, relative to what Maki just said, in terms of having not enough personnel to address the needs of dual language learners. The National Academy report and also some teacher competencies that I've worked on in the past, we're very clear. We know that the majority of teachers and providers may not have the language capability, but there are techniques and there's teaching strategies that they can employ to help with the teaching of dual language learners. So we don't want to say that just because you don't speak the language of the child, you're not able to help that child. I don't think that that's where we want to go with that. So those are my comments on QRS. And then with respect to IEPs, I think for dual language learners and special needs populations, it's really, really difficult. And I think it's a double-edged sword because you get a lot of positive you get false positives a lot. Many children who are learning English as a second language are not being served because people think, well, they're going to take 2 or 3 years to learn the language, and so just leave them alone. When early and it might be something that's organic with them, so that early intervention would actually help them. Now, how that information is shared between systems is a major obstacle, and I don't know, and Julie, you may know how that might be bridged between the preschool environment and the K through 3 environment as a child moves through that trajectory.
My sense is that there's not a lot of bridging from pre-K to K unless the child stays within the same, if it's a state pre-K and the child stays in the same school or in the same system. It's difficult to get that information across. And there's sometimes K-12 systems have different tests that they have to provide, a specific test they have to do in order to be able to diagnose a child. So they wouldn't be able to use what was used in the pre-K anyway.
Right.
Great. And then, Marlene, I think this one is for you since it's specific to California. The setup is that while there's some system-level DLL policies in California that guide assessment for early learners, for example, the DRDP assessment, there's no specific policy for the kindergarten readiness assessment when it comes to how those are administered. And so do you have any thoughts on steps districts, what steps would districts take to use that assessment to ensure it's accurately assessing child development and what a child understands on a concept level?
Well, we do have the DRDP, the developmental profile, can be used in kindergarten, and there are some programs that have in fact used it in kindergarten. And what's interesting, and I did not mention, was that within the DRDP for K, there actually are indicators for home language development in Spanish. So there is the possibility of using that. Now, to what degree a particular locality will use that depends on their funding and their program and whether they have adopted, decided to use the DRDP. So I would say that no, the DRDP can be used as a kindergarten, the kindergarten DRDP can be used as a kindergarten readiness assessment. Up and down the state of California, KRAs are being developed, and it's not clear to me that they're being developed with an eye towards focusing on the needs of children whose home language is not English. Now, one of the issues, and I think it was mentioned by one of the other speakers, with assessment and dual language learners is that, and this is mentioned in the National Academy report, is that we do not have normative data on bilingual language development. And that is a big challenge for us moving forward. One of the things that we need to always keep in mind is that to learn a second language, it can take anywhere between 4 and 7 years to become completely fluent in that language. And so we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about not only our pedagogical practices, but our assessment practices and our sets of expectations for children who are DLLs.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So we're just going to try and get to a few more questions. I know we're running over, but Julie, there's I think an interesting question just because of how many non-public schools and non-public programs are sort of in the early childhood space. So the question is, how do you see the role of non-public schools evolving for DLLs?
Yeah, in the pre-K space, a lot of students attend non-public schools, although because a lot of states are offering free pre-K to low-income students, and ELs or dual language learners are disproportionately low income, they might be more likely to be in the public programs. But we definitely have always seen the private sector starting dual language programs. Certainly, I think I have seen a sort of a synergy between the what districts are doing and what private schools are doing, and vice versa, where a private school might start a pre-K program, and those parents get really excited about dual language for their kids and ask the district, oh, can we do this in the public schools, and then vice versa, where the public school has a program, and then there's a demand among parents to start that early, especially, we want students who are going to be going into a bilingual program to be able to get a bilingual pre-K experience as well. And I'm pretty hopeful about how the non-public schools are sort of working into the system because of things like QRIs having sort of these overarching principles that folks can follow. And I think there's been a lot of attention at the state level and at local levels at the bridging of pre-K to K-5. And of course, at the K-5 level, there's also programs that provide services, Catholic schools, other kinds of private schools that offer dual language programs or bilingual programs. They are far fewer in number than the publics, but I think that as we've seen throughout the country, a lot of different kinds of programs are seeing how successful these programs are, dual language and bilingual programs, in getting English learners up to speed and successful.
Great. So then this will be the last question, and for folks whose questions we haven't gotten to, we'll be sure to answer you just directly via email. But Maki and Marlene, well, I've been getting a chuckle out of a few people who are writing in and saying, well, a state might have a policy, but are they really implementing it? Are they implementing it for all groups, et cetera, et cetera? And I'll just say, of course, we share your suspicion in doing this. It's not as if, I would say that we thought at least pointing out if a state had or didn't have a policy was just the most, very important starting point for this conversation. But so I think the sort of, how to proceed in an environment where there may be a policy, but there's really not effective implementation is I would say, part of the question. How do you move forward in these contexts where, where a state may be saying it's doing things and it's really not, or it might not be or not be doing it for, in any sort of detailed way for particular student subgroups. But then related to that, there's a national sort of question of, are there particular ways to think about the conversation we've been having here and the look at state-level policies to say, is there some sort of opening at the federal level now related to some of this menu of policy items that we pointed out? So, Marlene, maybe you could give reflections first, and then Maki, you could end us with your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that question goes to the heart of the matter, and that is you can have as many policy guidance documents as I showed you in my set of slides as you want, and they'll sit on a shelf, and who's going to pay attention to them? And it really comes down to commitment and dedication of particular individual programs, and it comes down to resources, i.e. money. And so in the policy work that I do, it's not just about what are the effective policies to promote for young dual language learners, is how are we going to fund those policies so that the State Department or other entities or localities, local educational agencies have the resources to actually go out and build workforce capacity, really work with programs to do appropriate assessment, work with families to educate them about their rights with regards to bilingual education. So that is a local control issue. And we keep hammering that home in many of our discussions with our gubernatorial candidates that are coming up the pike, who have, many of them have gone on the record, and we're going to hold their feet to the fire about funding for early childhood, because the question is an absolute correct question. You really have to think about, okay, how do we execute this? And so that, you know, there's no magic pill or for this. And with regards to the federal government, and Maki could probably talk more about this since that's more of your home base, is the Office of Head Start has shown tremendous leadership with regards to dual language learners, and I have to give them credit for that. They affected our policies here in California. We used their information to help move the needle here in California. And they reconfirmed in January of 2017 the dual language policies that were referenced by Maki early on. So the federal government is still, at least on paper, is behind it and supportive of it. So Maki, you might have a different perspective, but that's what I'm seeing right now.
Sure, yeah, I do. I want to second everything Marlene was saying about the issue of implementation, and just also just drive home the fact that, you know, our fact sheet, we used it kind of a checklist model so that it's easy to compare across states, but it really masks, the yes or no answers mask a wide spectrum of responsiveness at the local level. And I also want to just make a plug here for the fact that implementation is really just an important aspect of where advocates can get involved. And this is something that we also found in the QRIS report, that it's as policies are being rolled out that there's really an opportunity to be vigilant and for a wide range of stakeholders to really get involved and insert their expertise and the trusting relationships they have at the community level. And then in terms of federal policy opportunities, there are very few federal vehicles in terms of really directly implementing local policy. You know, Julie did mention ECEC, which I think very few states have taken the opportunity to weave in pre-K issues, especially as they relate to DLLs. Race to the Top, I think there was some effort made to try and raise accountability through that policy vehicle for subgroups, including DLLs. But it's really, as Marlene was saying, Head Start is a major federal program that through its guidelines can influence states to potentially align their state standards with some of the guidelines that they've laid out, really emphasizing the importance of home language. But also, you know, we're hoping that by talking about the child care development funds and the home visiting models, you know, these are federally funded programs that are being locally implemented, and I think that more federal guidance that prioritizes DLL families could go a long way to shifting the needle in terms of the attention that's paid to this community. So hopeful that the conversations will continue, and really just delighted to have all of you joining this conversation today.
Great. Thanks to everybody for hanging on through this extended Q&A period. We really appreciate your interest, and thanks for joining us. And Marlene, a very special thank you to you both for all your work and for taking time out of your busy schedule to add so much to the presentation today. We'll be sure to get back to everyone privately online with answers to any questions that we didn't get to just now. So again, thanks very much, and thanks to all of you who are on for the work that you're the important work that you're doing at the state and local level right now. Bye-bye.